The strangest part wasn't catching my husband with my best friend. It was realizing I had already stopped loving the life they thought they were stealing. People imagine betrayal arrives with screaming, broken glass, or dramatic accusations that echo through a house. Mine arrived on an ordinary Thursday evening, carrying nothing more than the scent of rosemary chicken drifting from my own kitchen and the sound of two familiar voices laughing behind a door that should have been closed. I stood in the hallway with my overnight bag still hanging from my shoulder, frozen not because I was shocked, but because every quiet suspicion I'd collected over the past several months had finally arranged itself into a single, undeniable truth. I wasn't early. They were simply careless. The lights in the living room glowed warmly against the first snowfall outside, making the house feel almost picturesque. It was the kind of home neighbors slowed down to admire during Christmas. Daniel always said we had built something people envied. He was right. He just misunderstood what we meant. I took one slow step toward the doorway. Rachel's scarf was draped across the arm of my sofa. Daniel's jacket lay on the floor beside it. Then I heard her laugh again. Not the polite laugh she used around strangers. The real one. The laugh I'd known since college. For a brief moment, memories flashed through my mind with painful clarity. Rachel standing beside me as my maid of honor. Daniel nervously practicing his wedding vows in front of the mirror while I teased him for being unable to memorize 2 paragraphs. Holiday dinners, beach vacations, birthdays, countless photographs where the 3 of us smiled as though loyalty could never expire. I finally reached the doorway. Neither of them noticed me. Daniel sat close enough that Rachel's hand rested comfortably over his. His expression looked lighter than it had in months. She leaned toward him, whispering something that made him smile before he kissed her without hesitation. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't reckless. It looked practiced, comfortable, routine. That realization hurt far more than the kiss itself. This hadn't begun yesterday. It had been happening while Rachel hugged me goodbye after dinner, while Daniel thanked me for working late, while I believed exhaustion was the reason our marriage had quietly grown distant. Neither of them heard my suitcase touch the hardwood floor. Rachel noticed me first. The color drained from her face so quickly I almost pitied her. Daniel turned seconds later. Every confident expression disappeared. His mouth opened, searching for words that refused to arrive. Silence filled the room. Not an awkward silence. A final one. I expected my heart to race. Instead, everything inside me became strangely still. I looked at Rachel first, then at my husband. Finally, I smiled. Not because I forgave them, not because I accepted what I had seen, because in that single moment I understood something they didn't. They believed they had reached the happiest chapter of their story. I knew they had just walked into the last chapter of mine. "I'll be gone before sunrise," I said quietly. Daniel blinked in confusion. "Emily, please." I lifted one hand gently before he could continue. "No," I said. "Don't explain. Whatever you say now belongs to the version of us that no longer exists." Rachel lowered her eyes toward the floor. For the first time in years, she had nothing to say. I picked up my suitcase. No tears blurred my vision. No shouting followed me down the hallway. No desperate questions stopped me at the front door. The snow had become heavier by the time I stepped outside. Cold air filled my lungs as I walked toward my car. Behind me, the front door opened. Daniel called my name once. Only once. I didn't turn around. He thought I was leaving because my heart had been broken. Rachel probably believed I would spend months crying over a marriage they had destroyed. Neither of them knew that 2 days earlier I had quietly signed the final documents with my attorney. Neither of them knew every financial record, every property agreement, every carefully preserved piece of evidence had already been organized. And neither of them had the slightest idea that the most dangerous mistake they would ever make wasn't falling in love behind my back. It was believing I was walking away with nothing. People like Daniel always believed success belonged to the person standing in the spotlight. They rarely noticed who had built the stage beneath their feet. When we first met, neither of us had very much. We were 2 young professionals renting a cramped apartment outside Columbus, Ohio, eating takeout on folding chairs because real furniture felt like an unnecessary luxury. Daniel worked in commercial sales, full of confidence and ambitious ideas. I had recently joined a respected interior architecture firm, spending long evenings sketching renovation concepts that most clients would never fully appreciate. Back then, I admired his optimism. He admired my discipline. It felt balanced. At least, it did in the beginning. Daniel loved telling people he was going to build an extraordinary future for us. Friends always smiled whenever he spoke because he had a gift for making ordinary dreams sound inevitable. He could walk into any room and convince complete strangers that success was already waiting around the corner. What few people realized was that optimism alone never paid mortgages. Discipline did. While Daniel entertained clients over expensive dinners, I quietly accepted additional design projects during weekends. I earned professional certifications one after another while everyone else relaxed. Promotions arrived because I showed up before sunrise and often remained long after the office lights had dimmed. Eventually, I opened my own design consultancy, then another. Later, I expanded into luxury residential renovation and boutique property investments. None of it happened overnight. Every contract represented months of preparation. Every completed project carried thousands of invisible decisions. Daniel enjoyed introducing me at networking events. "This is my wife," he would say proudly. "She's incredibly talented." People usually smiled politely before returning their attention to him. Neither of us corrected them. At the time, I didn't mind. Marriage wasn't supposed to be a competition. Our first home reflected both of us, although perhaps not equally. I selected the neighborhood after researching future appreciation values. I negotiated the purchase price. I supervised every renovation. I personally chose every material, every light fixture, every cabinet finish, every window placement. Daniel often joked that he only carried boxes while I transformed houses into homes. Everyone laughed, including me. Looking back, I wonder why that memory feels so different now. Rachel entered our lives during those years almost effortlessly. We had met during graduate school and remained inseparable afterward. She possessed an effortless charm that made every gathering livelier. She remembered birthdays, organized holiday dinners, and somehow convinced complete strangers they had known her forever. When Daniel first met her, he said I was lucky to have a friend like Rachel. I agreed. She became part of our traditions. Christmas mornings, summer cookouts, weekend lake trips. She had her own coffee mug in our kitchen. She knew where we kept the spare house key. She could walk through our front door without knocking. I considered that trust. Now I recognize it as access. The changes between Daniel and me happened so gradually that they almost escaped notice. He became distracted during conversations. Business trips became more frequent. His phone rarely left his hand. Whenever I asked if everything was all right, he smiled and blamed work. Ironically, I accepted that explanation because I understood what long hours looked like. I lived them. Meanwhile, my own career continued growing faster than I had expected. My company secured contracts restoring historic properties throughout Ohio. Investors sought my advice before purchasing aging estates. Local business magazines occasionally requested interviews, though I politely declined most of them. Attention had never interested me. Building things did. Daniel, however, seemed increasingly fascinated by appearances. Luxury watches, designer suits, new social circles. Conversations became less about building a future and more about looking successful. I told myself every marriage experienced seasons. Some were warmer than others. I believe patience solved most problems. What I didn't understand then was that patience only works when both people are protecting the same relationship. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, almost 3 months before I walked into my own living room and watched my marriage quietly collapse, my attorney, Michael Lawson, called with what sounded like an ordinary reminder. "Emily," he said, "I think it's time we updated every ownership document we discussed last year." His tone remained casual. Mine did too. "Let's schedule it." Neither of us mentioned Daniel. Neither of us mentioned Rachel. But when I ended the call, I stared through my office window at the rain sliding slowly across the glass. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, I suddenly realized I was no longer preparing for the future I thought I had. I was quietly preparing to survive the one I never expected. The truth rarely arrives all at once. It settles quietly into the spaces where trust used to live, waiting for you to notice that something no longer fits. After my conversation with Michael Lawson, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. Instead, I started paying attention. Not because I wanted to catch Daniel, because I wanted to understand the life I had apparently been living without realizing it. For years, I had believed our marriage was built on honesty. That belief didn't disappear overnight. It unraveled one thread at a time. Daniel's business trips became strangely predictable. Always 2 nights. Always scheduled at the last minute. Always ending with expensive restaurant charges that somehow never appeared on his company reimbursement reports. I never questioned them before. Now I simply made mental notes. I wasn't spying. I was observing. There is a difference. One evening, he announced he had to fly to Chicago for an important client meeting. He kissed my forehead before leaving. "I'll miss dinner tomorrow," he said with a tired smile. "I know," I replied. "I'll make it up to you this weekend." I smiled back. "Travel safely." After he left, I opened my laptop to finish reviewing architectural drawings for a historic hotel renovation. Around midnight, one of my project managers accidentally sent a group message intended for another client. Attached to the message was a photograph from a downtown restaurant. The picture wasn't meant for me. It featured several local business owners celebrating the completion of a commercial project. Standing in the background, laughing with a wine glass in his hand, was Daniel. Still in Columbus. Not Chicago. I stared at the image for a long time. Not because seeing him hurt. Because I realized how ordinary lying had become for him. The next morning he texted me. "The meetings are running late." I looked at the photograph again before replying. "Take your time." No accusation. No confrontation. Nothing. People often assume silence comes from weakness. Sometimes silence comes from certainty. A week later, Rachel invited me to lunch. She looked exactly as she always had. Elegant, confident, effortlessly warm. "You've been working too hard," she said after we ordered. "You need a vacation." I laughed softly. "Maybe. You deserve someone who appreciates everything you do." It was such a strange sentence that I almost asked her what she meant. Instead, I watched her carefully. She avoided my eyes for just a fraction of a second. Most people would have missed it. Design teaches you to notice details. The slightest shift in proportion. A shadow that shouldn't exist. A line that isn't perfectly straight. People aren't very different from buildings. Pressure always reveals hidden fractures. Over the following weeks, the small inconsistencies multiplied. Rachel suddenly knew about restaurants Daniel claimed he had never visited. Daniel recommended books Rachel had recently praised online. They interrupted each other's stories with effortless familiarity. Sometimes they laughed before the other person finished speaking. It wasn't proof, but it was rhythm. The rhythm of two people spending far more time together than they admitted. I never searched Daniel's phone. Never hired a private investigator. Never followed either of them. If trust required surveillance to survive, then trust had already died. Instead, I focused on facts that couldn't argue with themselves. Credit card statements, property records, corporate filings, insurance updates, routine documents most spouses never bother reading. Patterns slowly emerged. Large purchases, transfers between accounts, receipts from weekends Daniel claimed he was attending conferences. Then something even stranger appeared. A luxury furniture invoice had been delivered to our home by mistake. The shipping address wasn't ours. It belonged to a downtown condominium. The purchaser's name had been partially covered by a printing error. Only the initials remained. D.C. Daniel Carter. When I quietly asked him about it over dinner, he didn't hesitate. Probably identity theft. His answer came too quickly. I nodded. "You should report it." "I will." He never did. That evening, after Daniel fell asleep, I walked downstairs and poured myself a cup of tea. The house was completely silent. Snow drifted gently across the backyard beneath the porch lights. I suddenly remembered something Michael had once told me during a routine estate planning meeting. "Never make important decisions while you're angry," he had said. "Evidence is patient. Emotions aren't." I finally understood what he meant. The goal was never to expose a lie. The goal was to understand the entire truth before anyone realized you were looking. The following Monday, Michael called again. "I've finished reviewing everything you requested." His voice sounded calm. Professional. "There's something you need to see." I looked out the window toward the parking lot below my office. "I'll be there this afternoon." As I ended the call, I had no idea that the folder waiting on his desk wouldn't simply confirm my suspicions. It would reveal that Daniel's betrayal had begun much earlier and involved far more than just an affair. Sometimes the most important meeting of your life doesn't begin with bad news. It begins with someone quietly placing a folder on a table and waiting for you to be ready to open it. Michael Lawson had been my attorney for almost 8 years. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't exaggerate. If anything, his greatest talent was making serious situations sound almost ordinary. His office overlooked the Scioto River, and every time I visited, the room smelled faintly of leather-bound books and fresh coffee. Normally, our meetings focused on investment properties, business acquisitions, or estate planning. This one felt different before either of us spoke. Michael slid a thick navy blue folder across the conference table. I reviewed every document you asked for. I nodded, and he folded his hands together. I think you're asking the wrong question. That caught my attention. I thought I was asking whether my husband is hiding assets. You were. He paused. But that's no longer the important part. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Michael opened the folder. Inside were property records, bank statements, corporate filings, insurance documents, and copies of agreements I barely remembered signing over the years. He organized everything with color-coded tabs. Blue, green, red. Every section represented another piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized existed. He pointed toward the first document. Do you remember creating Carter Residential Design Holdings? Of course. It owns your consulting business. Yes. And who owns Carter Residential Design Holdings? I do. He smiled slightly. No. I frowned. The company does. He turned another page. You own 100% of the holding company. Another page. The holding company owns your operating businesses. Another. The holding company purchased your investment properties. Another. The holding company financed your renovation projects. Then he looked directly at me. Not Daniel. I remained silent. Michael continued. Every recommendation I made over the last several years had one purpose. Asset protection. I remembered those conversations now. Every time we purchased another property, Michael insisted ownership remain carefully structured. When I questioned the extra paperwork, he always answered the same way. Hope for the best. Prepare for the unexpected. At the time, I thought he was simply being cautious. Now I understood. He had been building legal walls around everything I had created, without ever suggesting I might one day need them. He opened another section. This concerns your primary residence. I recognized the address immediately. Our home. The place Daniel believed represented everything we had built together. Michael handed me the deed. You purchased the property before the last refinancing. Yes. You used proceeds generated entirely through your holding company. I nodded again. He tapped a paragraph highlighted in yellow. The ownership structure never changed. It took several seconds for the words to register. Daniel lived there, helped decorate it, invited friends into it, called it his house. But legally, it wasn't. Michael reached for another document. The vacation property. Same structure. The downtown commercial building. Same structure. The investment accounts. Same structure. Everything had been deliberately separated years earlier. Not hidden. Protected. I leaned back slowly. So what you're telling me, he finished the sentence, is that your financial future is considerably more secure than you realize. Relief should have been the first emotion I felt. Instead, I experienced something closer to clarity. For months I had feared losing everything. Now I understood I had never been protecting money. I had been protecting peace. Michael closed one section before opening another marked in red. This is where the conversation changes. Inside were financial transfers, wire records, corporate expense reports, personal credit activity. He pointed towards several transactions. Your husband has been moving money. I looked closer. The amounts weren't enormous. $5,000, $7,000, $12,000, spread over many months. Small enough to escape casual attention, large enough to matter. They all came from his personal accounts, Michael said. Not yours. So he hasn't taken my business assets. No. He paused again. But someone has been helping him finance a completely separate life. My eyes drifted to the final page in the section. The recipient's name appeared repeatedly. Rachel Morgan. The room became perfectly silent. Michael didn't offer sympathy. He didn't need to. Facts often speak louder than comfort. Finally, he leaned forward. Emily, I need to ask you one question. I looked up. When you walked into my office today, were you hoping to save your marriage? He let the sentence fade. Or were you hoping to understand the truth? I stared at the folder for a long moment before answering. I think. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. Those became two different things a long time ago. Michael nodded once. In that case, he said quietly, sliding one final envelope toward me. It's time we begin preparing for the day they finally believe they've won. The easiest way to fool someone is to let them believe they've fooled you first. After my meeting with Michael, I stopped searching for answers. I had enough of those. What I needed now was patience. The temptation to confront Daniel followed me everywhere. Every dinner we shared felt like theater. Every casual conversation carried an invisible script. He smiled across the table as though nothing had changed, while I found myself studying how easily a familiar face could become a stranger. It wasn't hatred I felt. It was distance. One evening, he walked through the front door carrying flowers. White lilies. My favorite. Or at least they had been years ago. I thought we could have dinner together tonight, he said, setting the bouquet on the kitchen island. I thanked him. I even smiled. Not because the gesture meant anything anymore. Because I wanted him to believe it still could. He spent the evening talking about work, complaining about clients, laughing at stories from the office. Every lie flowed naturally into the next until I wondered if he even recognized them as lies anymore. When he reached across the table and squeezed my hand, I noticed he wasn't wearing his wedding ring. He followed my eyes and casually slipped it back onto his finger. I took it off at the gym. Of course. Another effortless explanation. Another effortless acceptance. I figured, I replied. That answer seemed to comfort him more than any argument ever could. Over the following weeks, I became the version of Emily he expected. Busy, trusting, focused on expanding my business. If he stayed out late, I wished him a good evening. If Rachel invited me to lunch, I accepted whenever my schedule allowed. If either of them lied, I quietly made room for another fact. Meanwhile, Michael and I met every Friday morning. Always before my first client appointment. Always in the same conference room. Each meeting added another layer of preparation. We reviewed ownership records, updated beneficiary designations, reorganized investment accounts, transferred sensitive business files into secured digital storage. Nothing illegal, nothing dishonest. Simply making sure every document accurately reflected reality. One afternoon, Michael placed a legal pad in front of me. I want you to answer one question. I picked up the pen. If Daniel asked for a divorce tomorrow, what would you want? The answer surprised even me. I don't want revenge. Michael nodded. I believe you. I want fairness. He smiled faintly. Good. Because fairness lasts longer. That sentence stayed with me for days. Fairness. Not punishment. Not humiliation. Justice didn't require anger. It required preparation. Around the same time, Daniel became unusually generous. Weekend getaways. Expensive dinners. Unexpected gifts. Anyone looking from the outside would have believed our marriage was improving. Only I noticed something strange. His kindness always appeared after he disappeared for several days. As though guilt had become another monthly expense he simply budgeted for. Rachel played her role just as convincingly. She called more often, dropped by with coffee, asked about my latest renovation projects. One afternoon, she stood beside me while I selected marble samples for a client's estate. I don't know how you do it, she said. You've built such an incredible life. I smiled. So have you. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. A tiny hesitation. A flicker of discomfort. Then it disappeared. She still believed I knew nothing. That illusion was becoming increasingly valuable. Late one Friday afternoon, Michael received a phone call while we were reviewing my estate documents. He listened quietly before hanging up. Interesting. What is? He turned his monitor toward me. A public real estate listing filled the screen. Luxury condominium. Downtown Columbus. Recently furnished. Recently occupied. The purchasing entity wasn't Daniel. Nor Rachel. It was an LLC created barely 4 months earlier. Michael typed a few commands before opening another document. The registered mailing address belonged to Daniel's financial advisor. Another click. The startup funds for the LLC originated from several personal transfers Daniel had made over the previous year. He looked at me carefully. They're building a future. I stared at the screen. No. Michael raised an eyebrow. They think they are. For the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to imagine what Daniel and Rachel believed their lives would soon become. A beautiful condominium. My husband finally free from his marriage. My best friend stepping effortlessly into the life we had built. They probably pictured romantic dinners, vacations, celebrations, and a future without consequences. They had no reason to think otherwise. After all, I hadn't argued. I hadn't hired a private investigator. I hadn't exposed them to family or friends. From their perspective, I was simply a woman quietly accepting defeat. As I stood to leave Michael's office, he handed me a sealed envelope. Don't open this yet. What is it? The final filing. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. When should I use it? Michael smiled with the calm confidence that had steadied me from the beginning. The day they stop hiding. I slipped the envelope into my briefcase and walked toward the elevator. Some people mistake silence for surrender. Daniel and Rachel were about to make that mistake together, and it would become the most expensive assumption either of them had ever made. People often ask why I didn't leave the moment I discovered the affair. The answer is simple. Because leaving quietly and leaving wisely are two very different things. The morning after I walked out of my house, I checked into a boutique hotel overlooking the river. I deliberately chose a place where no one who knew Daniel would think to look for me. The room was elegant without feeling extravagant, and for the first time in months, silence belonged entirely to me. My phone began ringing before 8 o'clock. Daniel. I watched his name appear across the screen until it disappeared. A minute later, he called again. Then again. By lunchtime, he had left 6 voicemails. I listened to none of them. Rachel sent a text shortly afterward. Emily, please let me explain. This isn't what it looks like. I almost laughed. There are very few sentences more dishonest than that one. I deleted the message without replying. By evening, mutual friends had begun reaching out. Some wanted to know if everything was all right. Others casually mentioned seeing Daniel looking completely devastated. Apparently, he was telling people we had experienced a misunderstanding. That word fascinated me. A misunderstanding. As though two people accidentally spent months planning a future together. As though betrayal were simply a communication problem. I said nothing. The less I explained, the more comfortable Daniel became writing his own version of events. Exactly as Michael predicted. 3 days later, I returned to my office. Business had never stopped simply because my marriage had. Clients still expected presentations. Contractors still needed approvals. Historic properties still required restoration. Work became my sanctuary because buildings followed rules. People often didn't. Late that afternoon, Michael arrived carrying another folder. I've officially filed the documents. I nodded. So everything is protected? He smiled. It has been for years. Then he placed a second envelope on my desk. This one is different. I opened it. Inside was a draft separation agreement. Simple, professional, fair. Daniel would retain every asset that genuinely belonged to him. His retirement accounts, his personal vehicle, his individual savings, everything he had earned. Nothing more, nothing less. He'll never accept this, I said quietly. Michael folded his arms. I know. Then why prepare it? Because judges appreciate reasonable people. I looked at him. And unreasonable ones usually reveal themselves. For the first time since everything had begun, I realized Michael wasn't merely preparing paperwork. He was preparing a narrative. Every decision, every email, every legal filing, every unanswered message. Together they would eventually tell one consistent story. Not to Daniel. To a courtroom, if necessary. That evening I drove past our neighborhood without turning onto my street. Old habits almost pulled me home. Instead, I kept driving. As I passed the entrance, I noticed an unfamiliar moving truck parked near the subdivision. Curiosity lingered for only a moment before I continued toward downtown. The next morning, my curiosity received an answer. A neighbor I had known for years called me. Emily. She hesitated awkwardly. I wasn't sure whether I should tell you. What happened? I saw Daniel yesterday. I remained silent. He wasn't alone. Of course he wasn't. He and Rachel were moving furniture. My grip tightened around my coffee mug. Into your house. Not visiting. Not helping. Moving in. Already. Barely 72 hours after I had walked away. The speed of it should have hurt. Instead, it confirmed everything. This hadn't been an impulsive affair. It had been a carefully planned replacement. Rachel hadn't stolen moments. She intended to inherit an entire life. After ending the call, I stood beside my office window watching people hurry along the sidewalk below. Each person carried invisible burdens. Mine suddenly felt much lighter. There was no marriage left to save. Only decisions left to make. That afternoon, Daniel finally sent a message different from all the others. We need to discuss dividing everything fairly. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Everything fairly. The irony almost made me smile. He still believed everything included the house, the companies, the investment properties, the future I had spent nearly 15 years building. He still believed silence meant surrender. He still believed he was negotiating from a position of strength. I forwarded the message to Michael without adding a single word. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang. "Emily," he said calmly. "I think they've officially stopped hiding." I looked at the sealed envelope resting inside my desk drawer. The one Michael had told me not to use until that exact moment. Slowly, I opened the drawer, lifted the envelope into my hands, and realized that from this point forward, every move Daniel made would no longer bring him closer to victory. It would simply carry him deeper into a trap he had spent months building for himself. Nothing exposes a person's character faster than believing the prize already belongs to them. Daniel insisted we meet in person. Not at our house. Not at my office. He chose a quiet steakhouse downtown, one with polished wood walls, white tablecloths, and enough privacy that uncomfortable conversations could disappear beneath the soft music. I arrived exactly on time. He was already seated. For a moment, he looked relieved to see me. "Emily." I nodded politely. "Daniel." There was no hug, no awkward attempt at affection. Only two strangers sitting across from one another, pretending they still understood the person opposite them. He spoke first. "I've made mistakes. I waited. I never wanted to hurt you." Still, I said nothing. Silence has a peculiar effect on guilty people. They rush to fill it. "I think we've both changed over the years." Another pause. "I don't want this to become ugly." Finally, I answered. "Neither do I." His shoulders visibly relaxed. It was exactly the response he had hoped to hear. The waiter approached, but neither of us ordered more than coffee. This wasn't dinner. It was a negotiation. Daniel leaned forward. "I think we should divide everything fairly." There was that word again. "Fairly." "I agree," I replied. His confidence grew immediately. "I know the house means a lot to you." I almost smiled. "Does it? You can keep some of the furniture if you'd like." "Some furniture." The sentence revealed more than he realized. He was already imagining himself living there. Rachel probably was too. "I've also been thinking about the businesses," he continued. "I know you've worked hard, but I supported you for years." Supported me. The irony settled quietly between us. He remembered attending charity galas. He remembered celebrating completed projects. He remembered standing beside me in magazine photographs. He had somehow mistaken witnessing success for creating it. "I think we should each receive an equal share." His voice remained calm, reasonable, almost rehearsed. I reached into my briefcase. His eyes immediately dropped toward it. Perhaps he expected anger. Perhaps evidence. Instead, I removed only a single envelope. The same envelope Michael had handed me days earlier. I placed it gently on the table. "This is for you." Daniel looked confused. "What is it?" "Read it." He opened the envelope. Inside was the proposed separation agreement Michael had prepared. His expression remained confident through the first page. Then the second. By the third page, the confidence began disappearing. "What is this?" "The agreement." "No." He flipped backward. "This can't be right." "It is." His eyes moved rapidly across the legal descriptions. Primary residence, business ownership, holding company, investment properties, commercial real estate. Everything listed exactly as it existed, not as he imagined it. "There has to be some mistake." "There isn't. You can't seriously expect me to sign this." "I don't expect anything." His voice grew sharper. "The house belongs to both of us." "It doesn't. I've lived there for 15 years. I know. My name should be on everything." "It isn't." People at nearby tables briefly glanced in our direction before returning to their meals. Daniel lowered his voice. "This is ridiculous." "No. It's documented." He stared at me as though seeing a completely different woman. "When did you do this?" "I didn't." "What does that mean?" "It was always this way." That answer unsettled him more than anything else could have. His version of reality had depended on believing I changed the rules after discovering the affair. Instead, he was learning the rules had never changed at all. He simply never bothered to understand them. He reached the final page. "The businesses are protected through a holding company." "Yes." "The properties too?" "Yes." "And you own all of it?" I shook my head gently. "My company does." He looked completely bewildered. "What difference does that make?" "A very large one." For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The waiter quietly refilled our coffee before disappearing again. Daniel finally pushed the papers away. "This isn't over." "I know. I'm getting my own lawyer." "I assumed you would." His eyes narrowed. "Were you planning this while we were still married?" I looked directly at him. "No. I was planning responsibly while you were planning an affair." For the first time since sitting down, He had no immediate response. The confidence that had carried him into the restaurant had vanished completely. As I stood to leave, I placed enough cash on the table to cover my coffee. I hope you find an excellent attorney. He looked up sharply. You sound awfully confident. I adjusted my coat before answering. I'm not confident because I expect to win. I met his eyes one final time. I'm confident because the truth doesn't change depending on who finally decides to read it. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Behind me, Daniel remained frozen in his chair, staring at documents that had quietly existed for years. What he still didn't know was that the legal agreement wasn't the most devastating thing waiting for him. It was merely the first page of a story he had never realized someone else had been writing all along. The moment people realize they can't take your future, they usually try to rewrite your past. Less than 24 hours after our meeting at the restaurant, Daniel hired an attorney. I knew because Michael called before 9 that morning. They've responded. I closed the architectural plans spread across my desk. That was quick. It usually is when expectations collide with reality. He forwarded the documents to me. The first few pages contained predictable legal language. The rest revealed exactly what Michael had anticipated. Daniel wasn't simply contesting the separation agreement. He was rewriting our marriage. According to his filing, he had sacrificed his own career to support my ambitions. He claimed he had contributed equally to building my companies. He suggested my business success existed only because he had provided emotional and financial stability throughout our marriage. I finished reading before quietly setting my tablet down. None of it made me angry, because none of it was true. Facts have an advantage over stories. They leave records. Michael arrived at my office shortly after lunch, carrying another familiar blue folder. I thought we'd review this together. He placed several binders across the conference table. Payroll records, corporate tax filings, loan agreements, property closing documents, employment contracts. Every important decision my companies had ever made carried one constant signature. Mine. When was the last time Daniel attended a board meeting? Michael asked. He never attended one. Because he wasn't a director. Michael nodded. And who guaranteed the commercial loans? I did. And who personally invested the startup capital? I did. He smiled faintly. That's why documentation matters. For nearly 2 hours, we organized years of evidence into chronological order. Not because we needed to create a defense, because the truth deserved to be easy to understand. As we worked, I found myself remembering moments that had once seemed insignificant. The nights I stayed awake reviewing construction budgets while Daniel slept. The weekends I spent visiting renovation sites during freezing Ohio winters. The vacations I canceled because clients faced unexpected delays. None of those sacrifices had felt extraordinary at the time. They simply felt necessary. Success had never arrived as one dramatic achievement. It arrived through thousands of ordinary decisions repeated consistently. Late that afternoon, my phone vibrated. Rachel. For several seconds, I considered ignoring the call. Instead, I answered. Hello. Silence. Then a nervous breath. I know you probably hate me. I don't. She sounded surprised. I just wanted to explain. There isn't much to explain. It wasn't planned. I looked through the glass wall of my office toward employees finishing another productive day. Rachel. My voice remained calm. When did it begin? She hesitated. A little over 2 years ago. 2 years. Not 2 months. Not one mistake. 2 years of shared holidays. Birthday dinners. Weekend vacations. Christmas mornings. 2 years of sitting across from me while pretending friendship still existed. I'm sorry, she whispered. I believed she meant those words. Not because she regretted betraying me. Because consequences had finally become visible. I hope you're honest with yourself one day, I said quietly. Before she could answer, I ended the call. That conversation changed something inside me. Until then, part of me had still been grieving the marriage. Now I understood I had actually been grieving an illusion. The marriage I missed had ended long before I discovered the affair. I had simply been the last person to know. That evening, Michael emailed another update. Daniel's attorney had formally requested access to my business financial records. Expected. Routine. Nothing alarming. Except for one small detail attached to the request. Daniel claimed partial ownership of future development projects that had not even begun. I laughed softly when I read it. He wasn't asking for fairness anymore. He was asking for tomorrow. The next morning, Michael called again. I have good news. I'm listening. His attorney finally requested the ownership documents, and there was a long silence after they received them. I smiled for the first time that week. What kind of silence? The expensive kind. I knew exactly what he meant. Some discoveries don't end an argument. They end a strategy. Later that afternoon, I drove past the downtown condominium Daniel had secretly furnished with Rachel. Moving boxes still lined the entrance. A delivery truck unloaded expensive furniture onto the sidewalk. Watching from inside my car, I realized something almost poetic. They had decorated an apartment for a future they believed my life would finance. Neither of them understood that every payment, every investment, every assumption they had built that future upon had already collapsed before they ever carried in the first sofa. As I drove away, my phone buzzed once more. It was a message from Michael. Only 6 words. His lawyer wants to schedule mediation. I looked at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone back beside me. Daniel thought mediation would save him. He still believed this was a disagreement over property. He had no idea it was about to become a public accounting of 15 years of truth. Real victory rarely arrives in a courtroom. It arrives in the quiet moments beforehand, when one side finally understands the case was decided long before anyone entered the room. Our mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. Michael and I arrived 15 minutes early. He believed punctuality communicated respect. I believed it communicated preparation. The conference room was simple. A long wooden table, neutral artwork, fresh coffee. No one seemed interested in drinking. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, only folders, pens, legal pads, the ordinary tools that often dismantle extraordinary illusions. Daniel entered a few minutes later with his attorney. He looked tired, not defeated, just unsettled. Rachel wasn't there. For reasons I understood immediately. Affairs can survive private conversations. They rarely survive legal proceedings. After brief introductions, the mediator explained the process. We're here to determine whether an agreement can be reached without litigation. Everyone nodded. Daniel's attorney spoke first. His presentation was polished, professional. He argued that marriage represented a partnership extending beyond formal ownership. He emphasized emotional support, shared sacrifice, joint planning, years invested together. Listening to him, I almost admired the performance. If documents didn't exist, it might even have sounded convincing. When he finished, the mediator turned toward Michael. My client agrees that marriage is a partnership, Michael began calmly. That's why she never disputed Mr. Carter's ownership of the assets he actually acquired. He slid a binder across the table. However, partnerships also leave records. The first exhibit contained incorporation documents. Second, loan guarantees. Third, commercial financing agreements. Fourth, tax filings. Each page quietly answered another claim Daniel had made. No speeches were necessary. The signatures spoke for themselves. I watched Daniel's attorney flip through the binder. At first, he moved confidently, then more slowly. Eventually, he stopped turning pages altogether. He leaned toward Daniel and whispered something too softly for me to hear. Daniel's expression changed almost immediately. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked dangerously close to panic. The mediator requested a short recess. As everyone stood, Michael remained seated. He simply organized his documents into neat stacks. You expected this, I said quietly. I expected professionalism. And he looked toward the hallway where Daniel and his attorney were speaking urgently. Professionals adjust when facts change. Several minutes later, everyone returned. The atmosphere had shifted. Daniel's attorney no longer argued for equal ownership of my companies. Instead, he proposed discussing only marital property accumulated jointly during the marriage. A much smaller conversation. Michael accepted the adjustment without comment. The negotiation continued for hours. Vehicles, retirement accounts, personal belongings, household furnishings, items that actually belonged in a separation agreement. Every time Daniel attempted to return to my businesses or investment properties, his own attorney gently redirected him. The legal reality had become impossible to ignore. Late in the afternoon, the mediator asked whether either party wished to make a final statement. Daniel surprised everyone. I just don't understand. His voice lacked the confidence I had grown accustomed to hearing. I thought we built all of this together. For the first time that day, I answered without consulting notes. We built a marriage together. I paused. I built a business. He looked at me helplessly. I was there. I know. I believed in you. And I appreciated that. Silence settled over the room. But believing in someone isn't the same as becoming their work. No one interrupted. Not even the mediator. I never asked you to sacrifice your career. I never asked you to guarantee my loans. I never asked you to sign contracts you didn't understand. I folded my hands together. You chose your path. I chose mine. The difference was that I kept records. Daniel lowered his eyes. For a brief moment, I almost recognized the man I had married years earlier. Not arrogant, not calculating, simply overwhelmed by consequences he had never imagined. Then his phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up. Rachel. He silenced the call immediately. But everyone had already seen the name. No one commented. No one needed to. Some truths require no explanation. As the mediation concluded, only a handful of issues remained unresolved. Nothing substantial. Nothing capable of changing the outcome. Outside the conference room, Michael handed me a slim folder. Keep this. What is it? The final accounting. I opened it briefly. Inside was a detailed summary of every asset, every account, every agreement, every obligation. At the very bottom sat one final figure. The complete net worth of everything I had built. For years, Daniel had believed he understood the value of my success. Seeing the numbers gathered in one place made me realize something surprising. He had never truly known me at all. As we walked toward the elevator, Michael pressed the button and looked at me with the same quiet confidence he had carried since the beginning. The hardest part is over, he said. I glanced once toward the closed conference room, where Daniel remained behind with his attorney. No, I answered softly. For him. I stepped into the elevator as the doors began to close. It's only just beginning. People imagine that justice arrives with a dramatic verdict. In reality, it often begins with a single sentence spoken by someone who has finally accepted the facts. 3 days after mediation, Daniel asked to see me again. This time, I declined. There was nothing left to discuss privately. Every meaningful conversation now belonged between attorneys. Michael handled the response with a brief email. Future communications regarding the separation should be directed through counsel. Professional. Polite. Final. That afternoon, Daniel called anyway. I let the phone ring until it stopped. A minute later, another call. Then another. Finally, he left a voicemail. His voice sounded different. Less certain. Emily, I think we've both made mistakes. I don't want lawyers deciding our future. We can still work this out. I listened once. Then archived the message. Not because it hurt. Because it documented exactly what Michael expected. When confidence disappears, negotiation becomes reconciliation, or the appearance of it. The following morning, I met Michael at his office. He had already reviewed several new filings. Daniel's attorney had withdrawn multiple claims regarding my companies and investment properties. No explanation, just quiet revisions. That's significant, I said. Michael nodded. They've stopped arguing with the documents. What happens now? Now they start looking somewhere else. He slid another folder across the desk. Inside were copies of Daniel's financial disclosures, personal checking accounts, credit cards, retirement savings, outstanding debts. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then Michael pointed towards several highlighted entries. Repeated cash withdrawals, luxury purchases, furniture invoices, jewelry, travel expenses, most of them dated within the previous 18 months. Recognize the pattern? He asked. I looked more carefully. Nearly every larger expense appeared shortly after one of Daniel's transfers to Rachel. He was funding 2 lives. Michael nodded. On one salary. I leaned back quietly. For years, I had believed Daniel's growing financial anxiety came from inflation, unexpected expenses, or poor budgeting. Instead, he had been financing an entirely separate future while allowing me to believe we were planning one together. The realization no longer felt personal. It felt mathematical. Numbers rarely lie. People often do. A week later, another unexpected development arrived. Rachel requested a meeting. Not through Daniel. Not through attorneys. Directly. Michael advised against it. You don't owe her anything. I know. But I'd like to hear what she has to say. We met in a small cafe on the edge of downtown. She looked exhausted. The confidence she once carried had disappeared beneath sleepless eyes and forced smiles. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked at me. He told me the businesses belonged to both of you. I said nothing. He said everything would be divided equally. Still nothing. I didn't know. Her voice cracked. I swear I didn't know. I believed her. Not because she was innocent. Because ignorance and innocence are different things. You knew he was married. I answered quietly. She lowered her head. Yes. You knew I trusted you. A tear rolled down her cheek. Yes. You simply didn't know the fantasy he promised wasn't real. She closed her eyes. No. That single word carried more disappointment than apology. For the first time, I realized Daniel hadn't lied only to me. He had been lying to both of us. He sold each of us a different version of the same future. Neither version could actually exist. Rachel reached into her purse and placed a small envelope on the table. I thought you should have these. Inside were photocopies, greeting cards, receipts, a handwritten note from Daniel. Nothing legally explosive. Nothing Michael didn't already understand. But together they established something important. A timeline. Clear. Consistent. Impossible to confuse. I don't want anything from him anymore, Rachel whispered. I looked at her for a long moment. I believe you. When we stood to leave, neither of us offered forgiveness. Some wounds heal without reconciliation. Outside, I handed the envelope to Michael later that afternoon. He reviewed the contents carefully. Then he looked at me. This doesn't change ownership. I know. It does change credibility. That distinction mattered. Because the next phase of the case was no longer about proving what belonged to me. It was about proving who had been truthful from the beginning. Late that evening, Michael called once more. I've received notice from Daniel's attorney. What now? They're requesting one final settlement conference. I walked toward the window overlooking the city lights. And if it fails? Michael paused for only a second. Then everything becomes part of the official court record. I stood silently, watching the reflections of countless office windows shimmer across the river. For months, Daniel had hidden behind private conversations, whispered promises, and carefully constructed stories. Soon, every promise would meet every document. And stories have a remarkable habit of disappearing the moment the evidence begins speaking for itself. The final settlement conference lasted less than 90 minutes. Months of deception collapsed much faster than they had been built. Michael and I arrived carrying the same organized binders that had quietly followed us from meeting to meeting. Nothing had changed inside them. The facts never needed revisions. Daniel looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence that once filled every room had been replaced by someone constantly searching for another solution. His attorney greeted us professionally before closing the conference room door. We'd like to discuss a revised proposal. Michael simply nodded. We're listening. The new proposal looked very different from the first one. There were no demands for my companies. No claims against the commercial properties. No requests involving future developments. Only the assets that actually belonged inside a marital settlement. Vehicles, savings, retirement accounts, personal possessions. It was, at last, a document grounded in reality. Michael reviewed every page carefully. Then he handed it to me. What do you think? I read each paragraph slowly. Years earlier, I would have searched for hidden meanings. Now I looked only for facts. When I finished, I closed the folder. I can accept this. Daniel looked surprised. So that's it. I met his eyes calmly. That was always all I wanted. Fairness. Nothing more. Nothing less. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. I thought you wanted to destroy me. The room became strangely quiet. I never wanted that. You hired lawyers. I hired protection. You hid everything. I documented everything. They're different. He looked down at the table. I honestly believed we owned it together. I know. Why didn't you ever tell me? That question lingered in the room longer than any legal argument. I answered honestly. Because you never asked. During our marriage, Daniel had attended celebrations, ribbon cuttings, award ceremonies, holiday parties with clients. He enjoyed the success. He never asked how it was created. He never asked who guaranteed the loans, who signed the contracts, who carried the financial risk when projects nearly failed. He had mistaken proximity for participation. The distinction had finally become impossible to ignore. His attorney slid the revised agreement toward us. I believe this resolves every remaining issue. Michael glanced at me. I nodded once. Pens appeared. Pages turned. Signatures followed. 15 years of marriage officially became a stack of completed documents. No shouting. No accusations. Only ink. When everything had been signed, Daniel remained seated. I owe you an apology. I looked at him quietly. I should have respected what you built. His voice almost disappeared. And I should have respected you. For the first time since this began, I believed every word. Not because they erased anything. Because they arrived without expectation. He wasn't asking for another chance. He simply understood what he had lost. I thanked him with a small nod. Nothing more seemed necessary. Outside the building, Michael and I walked toward the parking garage beneath a gray autumn sky. How do you feel? He asked. I considered the question carefully. Lighter. He smiled. Most people expect triumph. It doesn't feel like triumph. What does it feel like? I looked upward as a cool breeze carried the first leaves across the sidewalk. It feels finished. That afternoon, I returned to the office. My employees welcomed me exactly as they always had. Design meetings continued. Clients called. Blueprints covered conference tables. Life had never paused. Only I had. Before leaving for the evening, I opened a storage cabinet containing the very first presentation board I had ever created when starting my business. The corners were worn. The colors had faded slightly. Across the bottom remained my handwritten note from 15 years earlier. Build something no one can take away. At the time, I thought I meant buildings. I smiled softly. I had unknowingly been describing myself. As I locked the office and stepped into the evening air, my phone buzzed. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Rachel. It was Michael. I just received confirmation from the court. The divorce officially entered. I thanked him before ending the call. The streetlights flickered on one by one as people hurried home from work. For the first time in months, I realized I had nowhere I was trying to escape from. Only somewhere new I was ready to go. Behind me remained a marriage built on assumptions. Ahead of me waited a life built on truths that had survived every lie, every signature, and every attempt to claim what had never belonged to anyone but me. The consequences of a decision rarely end the day the papers are signed. Sometimes they begin there. 6 months after the divorce became final, my life no longer revolved around court dates or attorney meetings. It revolved around ordinary mornings. Coffee before sunrise. Blueprints spread across my dining table. Construction sites that smelled of fresh lumber and possibility. I had spent so many months preparing for an ending that I almost forgot how peaceful beginnings could feel. Business had never been stronger. Several commercial developers had expanded their contracts with my firm. The holding company Michael had encouraged me to build years earlier continued acquiring properties one careful investment at a time. Nothing happened quickly. That was the point. Real wealth grows quietly. One afternoon, Michael invited me to lunch. Not as my attorney, as my friend. You know, he said while stirring his coffee, I haven't billed you in months. I noticed. I wasn't sure whether I should feel proud or unemployed. I laughed. It was the first truly effortless laugh I could remember in a long time. Let's hope you stay unemployed. I prefer satisfied clients. So would I. For a while, we talked about anything except the divorce. Architecture, travel, books, ordinary conversations between ordinary people. That felt surprisingly extraordinary. Before we left, Michael handed me a thin envelope. What is this? Your final file. I looked inside. Every legal document from the case. Organized. Indexed. Complete. You should keep it. I probably won't ever read it again. I hope not. I smiled before placing it back into the envelope. Some chapters deserve preservation. Not because we want to relive them, because they remind us how far we've traveled. A few weeks later, I attended the grand opening of one of our largest commercial projects. The mayor gave a short speech. Clients shook hands. Photographers moved from group to group, capturing another successful development. As I stood speaking with investors, someone quietly said my name. Emily. I turned. Daniel. He looked healthier than the last time I had seen him. Not happier. Simply more honest with himself. He wore a modest suit instead of the expensive tailored jackets he once preferred. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I heard about the project, he finally said. Congratulations. Thank you. He glanced toward the completed building behind me. You really built all of this. There was no jealousy in his voice. Only recognition. Yes. I never understood. I know. He nodded slowly. I do now. We stood together in comfortable silence. Not because we had become friends. Because there was nothing left to argue about. I wanted to tell you something. I waited. I found another job. I'm glad. It's smaller. I hope it makes you happy. He smiled faintly. I think happiness and impressing people aren't the same thing. No, they're not. For the first time in years, we spoke without pretending to be different people. I was angry for a long time, he admitted. At you? At myself. That answer surprised me. I kept believing I lost everything because of the divorce. He looked toward the skyline. The truth is, I lost it long before that. He wasn't talking about money. I understood immediately. I hope things get better. They already have. He extended his hand. Not as a husband. Not as someone asking forgiveness. Simply as one person acknowledging another. I shook it. Then we walked in opposite directions. Neither of us looked back. Several months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Rachel had moved to another state. She had started over completely. New city, new career, new life. I wished her peace. Nothing more. Nothing less. Resentment requires energy. I preferred investing mine elsewhere. That evening, I returned to my office after everyone had gone home. The building was quiet. Sunlight faded across the empty drafting tables where young designers would arrive again the next morning full of ideas. I walked into my private office and noticed the old presentation board still hanging on the wall. Build something no one can take away. Years earlier, I believed success meant protecting buildings, businesses, and investments. Now I understood those had only been reflections. The most valuable thing I had protected was the woman capable of building them in the first place. No affair could steal that. No signature could transfer it. No betrayal could diminish it. As I switched off the office lights and locked the door behind me, I realized the greatest victory had never been keeping what belonged to me. It had been refusing to become someone else's loss instead of remaining entirely myself. People sometimes ask whether I regret leaving so quietly. They expect me to say yes. They imagine I wish I had screamed louder, argued harder, exposed every lie the moment I discovered it. But silence was never weakness. It was space. Space to think. Space to prepare. Space to choose the person I wanted to become after everything was over. If I had reacted with anger that night, I might have won the argument. By remaining calm, I won back my life. 2 years have passed since I walked out of my house before sunrise carrying only a single suitcase. The house itself has long since become someone else's address. The memories inside it belong to another version of me. I don't miss either one. My company has grown beyond anything I imagined during those early years when I worked alone at a folding table inside a rented office. Young designers now lead projects I once would have managed myself. Watching them succeed has become one of the greatest rewards of my career. Not because they need me, because they no longer do. Real success is building something that continues growing after you step away. Michael still sends me a message every year on the anniversary of the day our case officially ended. It always says the same thing. How's the future treating you? Every year, my answer becomes shorter. Better. Nothing more is necessary. The future has never required lengthy explanations. One autumn afternoon, I drove past the neighborhood where Daniel and I once lived. Not intentionally. A client meeting simply happened to be nearby. The streets looked smaller than I remembered. The trees had grown taller. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks where I once believed my entire future existed. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. Some places belong to memory more than they belong to us. As the traffic light turned green, I kept driving. Without hesitation. Without sadness. Only gratitude. Because I finally understood something that had taken years to learn. Home was never that house. Home was the peace I carried once I stopped asking other people to value what I had already learned to value myself. That evening, I hosted dinner for a few close friends at my new home. Nothing extravagant. Simple food, warm conversation, laughter that needed no effort. As everyone prepared to leave, one of my younger employees lingered behind. She had recently ended a difficult relationship. Quietly, she asked me a question. How did you know you'd be okay? I thought about it for a moment. Then I answered as honestly as I could. I didn't. She looked surprised. I only knew I couldn't build a peaceful future by staying inside a dishonest present. She smiled thoughtfully. I'll remember that. So did I. After she left, I walked onto the back patio with a cup of tea. The evening air carried the scent of fresh rain across the garden. The lights inside my home glowed softly through the windows. Everything around me had been built slowly, deliberately, honestly, not just the house, the life. For a long time, I believed the greatest betrayal in my story was that my husband chose someone else. Now I know that wasn't the real lesson. The real lesson was discovering that another person's betrayal should never become permission to betray yourself. Never abandon your standards because someone else abandoned theirs. Never surrender your integrity because someone else traded away theirs. And never confuse starting over with starting from nothing. I didn't leave my marriage empty-handed. I left carrying my experience, my work, my values, my name. The things that mattered most had always belonged to me. Everything else had only been temporary. Sometimes I think back to that final moment before dawn when I quietly closed the front door behind me. At the time, it felt like I was walking away from the life I had spent 15 years building. I couldn't have been more wrong. I wasn't leaving my life. I was leaving the only part of it that no longer deserved me. The sunrise I watched through my windshield that morning wasn't the end of my story. It was the first page of the one I finally had the courage to write for myself. And looking back now, I realized the greatest revenge was never watching the people who hurt me lose. It was building a life so full of peace, purpose, and self-respect that I no longer needed them to lose in order for me to win.